Hello, Facebook. Hello, YouTube. Hello, our other Facebook page. If you're watching us right now, make sure you smash that like button, as the influencers say. And well, hey, I'm Dan. I'm the program coordinator for the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network. That's part of the Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative. We've got 5 legislative fellows hanging out in Jefferson City, providing testimony, providing science notes, and providing science expertise to Missouri legislators when they need it. We have some big events coming up next week on Friday. We have a science policy roundtable discussion for the local science engagement network. And we're going to be talking about vaccine equity and equitable distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. We'll be joined by Dr. Daniel Hoft from St. Louis University. He's also the director of the Vaccine Trial Evaluation Unit in St. Louis. He was instrumental, one of the main primary investigators for implementing one of the COVID-19 vaccines. We'll also have contributions from Dr. Kazmikia Corbett from the National Institutes of Health. So come by, give us your tough questions. We want to talk about the vaccine, how to get it out there, and how to get it to the people who need it most. I also want to show you another event we have going on. Here it is, the Science and Technology Briefing for Missouri River and Conditions. This is a Most Policy Initiative SciTech briefing series. We're going to be joined by Dr. Amanda Cox from St. Louis University and Dr. David Rogers from Missouri S&T, and that is on Tuesday at 8 a.m. So go to mostpolicyinitiative.org/briefings to be a part of that. Without further ado, this is our science policy office hours, and we do want to talk about science policy. So talk about education policy. Here is Dr. Brittany Whitley from the Most Policy Initiative. Hello again, Brittany. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dan. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's a beautiful day here in Kansas City, although it is a little cold. So what do you got for us today, Brittany?
All right. So today I'm really excited to talk about empowerment scholarship accounts. And so really what we're talking about here is one type of school choice program that's being introduced and debated in Missouri right now. And so empowerment scholarship accounts, they're a tax credit scholarship program. And what that means is that people can make donations to a nonprofit scholarship granting organization and then claim a tax credit for some or all of that donation. And then students who receive these scholarship funds can use those funds to leave their assigned neighborhood public school and choose to attend maybe a private school nearby, a virtual school, and they can also use these funds on approved education expenses, so things like tutoring and textbooks. And I did want to point out that, like I mentioned at the top, there's lots of different types of school choice programs being talked about in Missouri right now. In the public school sphere, we see charter school expansion as something being discussed. And then when it comes to private school choice, in addition to these tax credit scholarships, we also see education savings accounts and vouchers. And so really a lot going on in this space, certainly plenty to watch. But today I want to talk mostly about empowerment scholarship accounts and more private school oriented choice options. So there's, even among the different tax credit scholarships that are being proposed, the population of eligible students is different. And so some programs allow any Missouri student who's attended public school maybe for the previous semester of school to participate, and then others in other states are more directly focused on people with certain incomes, maybe lower than the poverty level, and then also students with disabilities. So in the science note that I recently wrote and submitted as testimony for the Senate education hearing, that was testimony for informational purposes, there were 4 kind of major areas of research that I covered. The first is parent satisfaction. And so basically what we see is when we look at surveys of families who participate in these programs, they tend to be pretty happy with their new school choice options, particularly if they start in into a private school. Now, this might not be super surprising because they're now attending the school of their choice, but one of the kind of information that we're lacking is we don't really see a lot of surveys about the parents who remain at the district public schools and how these transfers affect their satisfaction with the school. The next thing I want to just really briefly talk about is academic achievement. And so one of the, big questions is, are these programs going to help our students do better? And what we tend to see is that students who transfer to a private school tend to either have no change in academic performance or improvements in their grades and test scores. Now, there's a really big caveat here, which is that most private schools don't actually require their students to take like the state mandated tests. So in Missouri, like MAP testing. And so this can make it really hard to compare achievement differences between public and private schools. Another really big aspect of this debate is who choice is accessible to. And so proponents of empowerment scholarship accounts point out that students shouldn't be limited to where they can go to school based on where they can afford to live. However, there are some concerns from people with some opposition to these bills about maybe certain students being turned away from private school options because of their religious affiliation. There's also fewer choice options in kind of more rural, remote locations. And so certain schools might, or certain students might have more options or less depending on where they live. And then the last is kind of a general school choice discussion, which is the amount of information that people have to make informed decisions about what the best school is, and making sure that these meetings and information are available to people who maybe don't speak English as their primary language or have work commitments so that they can't necessarily attend like an after-school meeting. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on in this area is how these types of programs affect public school funding. And so this is certainly a pretty complicated and debated aspect of the bill. So empowerment scholarship accounts are unique in that they are donation based. So the scholarship funds that students get come from donations. And so supporters of the bill argue that that is not, directly taking funding away from public schools. However, what we do know is that because people can claim a tax credit in the Senate bill that passed through, I believe it's up to $100 million of tax credits can be granted. We expect we're going to see a decrease in the amount of general revenue. And so while we might not directly be taking money out of the public school education fund, we might see kind of decreases in general revenue, which could lead to lower public school funding. There's also kind of certain states, so for example, in Kansas, when they run similar programs, they see that a lot of students tend to transfer from specific districts. And so this means that maybe some of the public school funding changes we see might be more concentrated in specific areas rather than kind of spread out across the board. So there's plenty of extra stuff to get into. I'm more than happy to answer questions, but I just wanted to end by saying that these bills are moving forward in the General Assembly right now. The Senate just passed a committee substitute that included empowerment scholarship accounts and charter school expansion. And the House is going to be hearing 2 bills on tax credit scholarships on Tuesday. So certainly a lot happening right now and a lot to watch.
It's really interesting, Brittany. It's really interesting how these scholarship grants could affect both public and private schools. How do you think these might have an effect on the competitiveness of public schools? We often hear that the more competitive a school is, the better a child does in there. So I wonder, if private schools are able to snatch kids away from public schools, if that might make public schools less competitive.
So this is certainly a big part of the argument. And so one of the things we hear is that if public schools are kind of competing for students because they're losing them to private schools, this might mean that private or public schools start doing better. So maybe they start improving their teaching or trying new approaches to education. However, kind of the flip side of that is that if public schools end up losing funding as they lose these students, they might actually have fewer resources to increase that competition. And so I don't think, as far as I'm aware, there's not really great evidence really in either way for this, but competition is certainly central to this debate. And I think something that you're going to hear a lot of talk about.
Yeah, we know that public schools across the board, and this is not just in Missouri, but just it seems like in every state that, funding gets cut and they just don't have, a bunch of resources to be able to, provide a quality educational environment to their students. What does the funding landscape for public schools look like right now?
So this is certainly a real challenge, especially in light of COVID-19. So I think across the board we're seeing challenges with funding. I'm more familiar. I know higher education funding is also having several challenges, especially in Missouri, but across the country. Um, my guess is that if you talk to most the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed or most teachers, they would probably say that they would like more money. And I know that there's bills right now to increase the amount of money we're spending on maybe early childhood education. So there's certainly a need for funding in public schools. And I think that's going to be a really important element of this school choice debate is how much these transfers actually end up taking away from public schools and what that means for the students who stay in those public schools.
That's really interesting. Last week we talked to a Missouri legislator about why he wants to cut public funding for higher education, and he says that a lot of higher education institutions, and I assume this includes high schools, colleges, and universities around the state. Is there an argument to be had where maybe they just need to be more efficient?
So this is also something I've written maybe a little bit of a related science note about this. And so I have heard the argument from some legislators that colleges need to be focusing maybe less on some of these general education or liberal arts degrees and focusing more on kind of job training, getting students in and out. So I do have a science note that's available on our website that talks about some of the benefits of getting general versus specialized education. I think that people tend to recognize that there's a little bit of a disconnect between higher education and how that relates to workforce development, but there isn't a lot of agreement on what we do to make that better. So certainly another really hot topic. I'm expecting most of what we see in higher ed this General Assembly is going to be almost entirely focused on funding and getting schools up to those levels. I think the other argument too, I'll just add in, is that colleges can increase tuition. And so that's usually been an argument of, well, if we give you less funds from the state, just up your tuition costs. And of course, that's going to also have some downstream effects. So when you take money away from one place or to give it to another, you kind of have to do a little bit of juggling to see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's a balancing act for many. I just want to remind everybody, if you have comments, if you have questions, write them down in the Facebook chat or in the YouTube chat below us. And I know there's sometimes a 30-second delay in between when we're talking and when we're able to answer those questions, but we'll get to them. We do have one question that's popped up from Dr. Eleni Bickle. Has COCID and online learning impacted the decisions that are being made right now on the topic?
Yeah, so I think what Eleni is talking about is some of the discussions around COVID and in-person versus remote learning. And so I'll say that this was really on the top of mind for a lot of people at the hearing on Tuesday for two of these empowerment scholarship bills. And so really the argument here is that families who are in a school district that has stayed primarily virtual, so I'm in Columbia, and Columbia Public Schools have been virtual, completely virtual until very recently. And parents who are really unsatisfied with not being in person kind of wish that they had another option of where to go to school. And so they see private schools maybe in their district open and think, well, can I go to that school because they're in person and I want my kid to be in person? And so that's certainly been a real driver here. And we see that being important to people testifying and the senators.
Mm-hmm. I know that COVID has been a real issue for many schools. I myself, I went to a private boarding school in Kansas. So they have in-person classes, they have in-person learning, but they can do it like a bubble. So no, if they have nobody in getting COVID, then they have nobody out getting COVID. So that's an advantage to that. I just want to remind everybody the comment section down below. Write your comments, and if you allow me to indulge you for a minute. Coming up on Tuesday, January 26th, we have a SciTech briefing series talking about Missouri river flooding and river conditions. Amanda Cox from St. Louis University will be there, and so will Dr. David Rogers. We'll be talking about everything pertinent to the Missouri River. back to Dr. Whitley here. Dr. Jenny Bradford has a question for you. Are there any additional requirements for standards for private education with these bills?
So this is a really great question. One of the things I try to do in my science note is link to this supplemental table that talks about some of the differences between the Missouri bills and different states. So the original set of bills that were filed, there was most of them, so I guess I'll start with assessments. Most of them require that private schools offer either the state-based test or a national norm reference test. And so there is a little bit of standardization when it comes to testing, but because they don't have to take the MAP testing, it does make it a little bit challenging. Most of the empowerment scholarship bills, I don't think had very many extra restrictions. There is an education saving account bill, so pretty similar approach. And they have a little bit more strict rules. So things like criminal background checks for employees, non-discrimination. However, again, I'll point out that usually non-discrimination rules are based on race, ethnicity, and country of origin, and they exclude religious affiliation. And so there does seem to be some legal precedent that private schools could say, you aren't the religious affiliation of this school, and therefore we reject your application.
Interesting. All right. Well, we're kind of running out of time here. So, Dr. Whitley, I will let you go, and I'll talk to everyone else for another 30 seconds.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for this information. This is a great series, great briefing. All right. Just remind everybody, next week, Friday, we will have our science policy office hours will be taken over by COVID-19 vaccine equitable distribution roundtable. We'll be joined by Dr. Daniel Hoft from the Vaccine Trial Investigation Unit in St. Louis. Sorry, I can't talk today. He was one of the main PIs in helping to test and approve the COVID-19 vaccines. We'll also be joined by Cynthia from Black Girls Do STEM. She has a great organization where she promotes STEM education for minority women in the St. Louis area. We'll also have comments that were pre-recorded and sent to us by Dr. Kizmikia Corbett. She is also one of the main people involved in developing the COVID-19 vaccines. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Check our newsletters for the links to these events. Technology prevented me from making a link or an invite to it. Oh, there's the dogs. It's time for me to go. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.